I'm Father Mark Hushen, an oblate priest, and most importantly, I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means for me that I've been abstinent from drugs and alcohol since 1988, when I got sober right in Washington, D.C., and as a result of that, my whole life has been transformed. I was able to complete my education. I was able to be ordained a Catholic priest, and for the last 17 years, my ministry has been devoted to easing the suffering of those who are addicted to drugs and alcohol and their families. If I was not sober, I probably wouldn't be in front of you today. Matter of fact, I'm sure I wouldn't be in front of you today because I probably most assuredly would not be a Catholic priest. When I got sober, some amazing things began to happen to me. One of the first things was I was asked to be the campus minister at Northeast Catholic High School in Philadelphia. And an amazing thing happened. All of the troubled boys in the school, most of whom other teachers and faculty members wanted to expel, came to me because I could understand the nature of their pain, what they were going through, the challenges their families were facing, and I was able to advocate for them and keep many of them in school because we got them the support, the counseling, the help that they need, and then we provided some kind of aftercare right in the school for them. And I can remember as clear as day, the principal one day walked past my office, and then I noticed he must have got 3 or 4 steps past the door. He stopped and he backtracked and looked in and kind of had this funny look on his face. And later in the day he says to me, Hushen, what's going on with you? All the hoodlums are in your office. And I affectionately referred to that as kind of, the ministry to, God's lost children. Because that's what really happens when someone gets caught up in addiction. They get really lost. And we are people that can help them find their way home to themselves, find their way home to God and to other people. And so I keep that story fresh in my mind because years later, I'm from a big family. There's 8 of us. My youngest sister was, in high school, and she had one of the teachers that I had. And when he was going down roll first day, he says, Hushen, any relation to Mark? Because I was a challenge in high school. And my sister Kathy says, yeah, that's my brother. Right? What's he doing with himself these days? Oh, he's a Catholic priest. When he was here, he was a hoodlum. And I tell that story because it's kind of indicative of the God's grace can work and transformation can happen. And when I am working with the patients and their families at Ashley, they are experiencing all kinds of suffering. Many who have lost loved ones. They have been raised by alcoholism or drug addiction. They're dealing with it in their families. And oftentimes when I'm talking to clergy, I say, the symptoms of alcoholism present themselves to you all the time. You just might not recognize them. Divorce, domestic violence, isolation in families, children failing out of school, children, young adults winding up in the court systems, and families are coming to you with these challenges. Are you asking the question, what is substance use or what is alcohol use like in your loved ones' lives? because it presents itself. Sometimes folks say, well, you're a frontline worker in addiction. Well, anybody that's working in a faith community, you're equally as frontline a worker, because they're oftentimes will come to you when in need of help. Michael gave us some pretty powerful statistics in the early talk today. Just recently, the leading cause of death for Americans under the age of 50 right now is drug overdose. Now, it's a scary, scary statistic. Substance use and abuse cost the United States $443 billion a year. The epidemic is staggering, and we're here today to talk about opioids, but alcohol is still king. 60% or higher of the people who come to Ashley for treatment, primary diagnosis is alcohol use disorder. So can't forget about that, even with all the press that opioid addiction and the crisis is getting. Alcohol still wreaking havoc. Alcoholism, drug addiction, substance use disorder, chronic health condition, needs ongoing support and treatment, a brain disease, and so we need, a good treatment, comprises medical treatment, psychological and clinical treatment, as well as spiritual care. And that's where I come in terms of providing the spiritual care, because my philosophical position is we come from God, and it's theological as well. Our whole journey is a journey back to God. And when addiction happens, we get hijacked, we get detoured, we get lost, and that spiritual hunger and thirst that we have as human beings, the addict or those who are addicted believe that hunger, that thirst can be satisfied by taking a substance. So I am going to quench the spiritual thirst that I have with spirits rather than the spirit, or with drugs rather than the spirit. So this whole 12-step transformational program is part of what we provide folks at Ashley, as well as really good clinical care, family support, medical care, and ongoing treatment, because sometimes people have this false notion that if my loved one goes to treatment and everything's going to be okay, they're going to get fixed. Well, like any other chronic health condition, you don't get fixed. You learn how to manage and how to live with it. And families need to learn how to manage and live with it. And we heard that earlier. The pain that families go through is devastating, especially when death occurs. And oftentimes, the pain that families go through is so disruptive to their lives that oftentimes family members become equally as challenged as the person who's using the substance. And so we at Ashley have a whole family wellness component, because their thinking gets distorted, behaviors are distorted, lots of anxiety, lots of depression, lots of mental health issues that are brought on by loving someone that is addicted. And, we heard this morning, just keep loving somebody. Well, sometimes, what do you do when love isn't enough? You need support, and you need help. And I think that's something that faith community could be a really big part of. Sometimes I get asked to share at local meetings and conferences like this. And, this 12-step spiritual process is really a modern-day way of appropriating the gospel. Because when the early people in recovery got together and formed Alcoholics Anonymous, they studied the Sermon on the Mount, they studied the letter of James, and they took a lot of tenets from the Judeo-Christian theological and religious traditions and built them into these 12 steps. And then when they realized, well, we have to make this broader and wider so we can kind of include everyone, the whole notion of God in a Christian way became God as you understand God. And there's a wonderful saying in the literature about the 12th step when it says, after someone is growing into this process, they will come to love God and call God by name, which is indicative of a personal relationship with God. And so the 12 steps are a systematic way of appropriating the life of grace, the life of virtue, and developing and falling in love with God. Because most of the folks that come for treatment that I deal with, and we have folks from all different faith traditions, a direct consequence of alcoholism, drug addiction, is getting disconnected from the spiritual dimension of your life. And most of them are disconnected from their faith communities and are not part of any active worship life anymore. They've gotten just disconnected because that's what addiction does. It's about isolation, disconnection, alienation, separation. Right? That's what it does to a human being. That's what it does to families. That's what it does for people when it comes to their faith communities. So faith communities can be a great place to welcome someone back. And I have some ideas around how that might happen. But as I talk to folks and I talk about the 12 steps, how are they transformative? Well, the 12 steps are a systematic approach for changing the neural landscape of the brain. Because addiction's a brain disease, so you have to change what's going on in the brain for a person to get healthy. So this 12-step process of recovery helps a person live in such a way that it changes the level of their neurotransmitters and the hormones that are being released in the brain so that their brains become a whole lot healthier. Right? And so the medical folks love that because it really helps them understand this is why you should become part of this 12-step fellowship, because it'll help change your brain. You change the brain, you change the game. And the game is life. Right? If I'm talking to the counselors and clinical folks, I'll say that the 12 steps are a systematic approach to cognitive restructuring and emotional regulation and behavior change. Right? That's what they help us to do. So in our Christian tradition, what are we talking about? Right? We're talking about Paul's letters and his writings when he says, I no longer live now, not I, but Christ lives in me. Or I live a life of faith hidden in Christ. Or I've taken off the old life and I've put on the new. And I've clothed myself with heartfelt mercy, right, and forgiveness and gratitude. And so what happens? A person kind of lives this program of recovery, and all of a sudden their thinking changes, their attitudes change, their beliefs change, their perceptions change, how they feel changes. I have a great way of working with folks and teaching them how to identify what they're feeling, how to feel it, how to process the feeling, and how to let it go. And then to learn through that whole process how your emotional states may be an avenue through which God is entering into your life. Right? So behavior change, it's the life of virtue. Right? What do we talk about? We have these middle set of steps that help us change old behaviors because we don't want to keep repeating things. And so most people, when they come into recovery, they have a whole behavior set that is negative because it's what helped them survive. And so what would we say that? Without judging or shaming, we say, what's it about? It's about manipulation. It's about deceit. It's about being dishonest. It's about getting whatever you need, right? And all of that is happening because the substance is now driving all of their decisions, right? So when they get sober, you take all of those behaviors and you flip them into the life of virtue. So rather than scheming, scamming, manipulating, stealing, lying, cheating, now you learn how to compromise, collaborate, negotiate, and be of support. Right? So that's just addictive behavior meeting grace and being transformed. In recovery language, we call it bedevilments, right? Behaviors that bedevil you, torture you as a result of your drug and alcohol use into the promises. And the promises are positive statements. Right? And how does that happen? Behavior meets grace, transformation, and now a person is living the life of grace. One of the things that I try to do all the time, since I'm an oblate of St. Francis de Sales, is use Silesian Spirituality, which is St. Francis de Sales' way of looking and appropriating the gospel. Use that in a way that's really helpful to folks. So I'm giving them Silesian Spirituality in concrete operational ways. They have no idea that's what I'm doing, right? But they love it. They love it because it works. So I'll give you a couple simple examples of that. St. Francis de Sales says, if you have a vice, right, that's dogging you, practice the opposite virtue. And in the practicing of the opposite virtue, you will find that over time, your behaviors will change. So where someone has a problem with ego and arrogance and braggadocio, we teach them how to acquire humility. Right? When somebody's really angry, right, we teach them how to acquire gentleness. Right? If someone's really envious, we help them see, that there's another way to look here, right? And we teach them how to be charitable and rejoice in the good that's happening to your brothers and sisters rather than being envious. If someone is struggling with greed and gotta have more, which is the addictive lifestyle, we teach them what? How to be generous, right? If someone is, struggling with, not being moderate, moderation is a good thing, right? Because if you are in recovery and you're not dealing with life, right, you can very quickly go from substance use disorder to now all of a sudden obsessively and compulsively gambling, spending, eating, shopping, sexing, you name it, right? And moderation helps us to live with balance in our life. And here's one of my favorite quotes of St. Francis de Sales. Moderation in all things except for the love of God. And that really works. So, if someone is struggling with lust in their life, what do? We teach them how to appreciate chastity. And what is chastity? It is seeking beauty in healthy ways. Seeking beauty in healthy ways. And if someone is a procrastinator extraordinaire, we just teach them how to have fire and desire and passion in their life. So that is a common way, that's a 12-step way of teaching people how to appropriate the life of virtue to change their behavior, right? So, and isn't that what Jesus was teaching his disciples? This is how you appropriate grace and virtue to change your behavior. Another part of that is, not only do they change their thinking and change their attitudes, behaviors, learn how to regulate their emotions. The 12 steps of recovery are a systematic approach to conversion and sanctification. Now, they're religious terms, right? And we hear all about, the whole need for a metanoia, a turning toward God, right? Because what happens when somebody gets lost in drug addiction or alcoholism, their lives, they've turned in different ways. So we turn them back to God. And then when I'm talking to the recovering community, I talk about how the 12 steps of recovery are a systematic approach to falling in love, right? With oneself, with God, and with others. And so it really is a transformative experience, top to bottom, upside down, inside out. We teach people all about forgiveness and how forgiveness has to be a part of their ongoing life, how forgiveness of self, forgiveness of others, and making amends and seeking forgiveness from those that they have hurt. And I can tell you that sometimes folks struggle with forgiveness of self, right, because they don't believe they're worthy. Or unfortunately, they were part of a religious tradition that beat them up with fear and shame. And so they don't want to come back to the faith community because that's who shamed them and that's who gave them a really distorted image of God. So finding faith communities that can welcome them back and who don't shame them is critical. It's really critical. So the bishop's initiative to say, what are we need to do some things here, I wholeheartedly support. So here's maybe some of those things that could be helpful. How often do clergy in the parishes preach about substance use disorder, about alcoholism and drug addiction, about what it's doing to the families in their community? I can assure you that many of the clergy in this diocese have buried someone as a direct result of overdose, right? Or someone's drank themselves to death. Where is the parish community in supporting that family who just lost that loved one? Is there any systematic way that can happen? Is there an opportunity for healing? An ecumenical healing service where a parish or a local group of faith communities come together and say, we are all facing this together, right? Let's put together something like, say, maybe around Thanksgiving, a time of gratitude, and let's do some kind of healing service for our families. I said to Bishop Burbage, does anyone at the Catholic Conference of Bishops have a seat at the legislative table in Washington, D.C.? Because you can bet the pharmaceutical companies do, you can bet the insurance companies do, you can bet the folks that want to legalize and grow marijuana, you better believe they're at that table. And if the faith community is not at the table, their voice is not being heard. And we have something to say about this issue. Some other things, are there opportunities to create substance abuse ministries in parishes where it's almost like a congregational team approach, where a team is identified, trained, and then set loose so that they can do what? They can increase awareness, right? So you walk into your parish community, into your parish center, into the church, and there's a literature rack. Where's the section on addiction and recovery? Do you open up and facilitate 12-step meetings? Do you invite them and say, we have a great space here? I mean, in this Good Shepherd, you could have 3 meetings running at once. You could have NAAA and Al-Anon, 3 different rooms. Are communities open to inviting, the recovering community inside and providing space? And most groups are pretty hospitable. They'll take care of the space, and they're used to paying some small fee. Most communities have bereavement groups. Is there anything special when we find out that it's something for a death due to overdose or alcoholism? So there's that whole notion of a team approach at a parish level that can do awareness, can do education, and can do recovery support activities for the community. Just really important, because one of the things that is still, and Michael addressed it, is still a huge issue, is shame and the stigma that this illness has. People don't see it as a progressive chronic medical condition. They see it as a moral failure. Still, even with all the science that we have, right? And so is that still happening, even if it's unspoken in our parish communities? You know, or do people feel welcomed and come back and will help you, you know, with what we're doing? You know, because as I said, most folks who are into, you know, an active addiction feel like they're not worthy of coming back, that God can't love them, they can't love themselves. If I go back to that community, I'm going to be judged, I'm going to be shamed. Or the same thing with a family. Oh my God, you know, I have a son or a daughter who's addicted to heroin. Is the community going to welcome me? How can we support you? We love you, we're in this with you. Or is it, you know, and so, you know, how do we make communities welcoming and inclusive and open and supportive? You know, Michael also mentioned prayer. So, you know, prayer services that focus specifically on, you know, healing and addiction and kind of breaking out of shame. Something that happened in the 1980s when HIV began to devastate the gay community, right? They didn't hide, right? They got right out in front and said, silence is killing us. Silence is still killing the alcoholic and the drug addict. And it's only when we get folks to be able to say, you know, we're like the bishop and his great courage, we're going to talk about this. Right? We're going to do something about this. We can no longer, you know, continue to lose a whole generation of young people. You know, most of the folks who come into opiates, there is a rising number that are adults who are prescribed pain medication who get addicted to it, but the biggest portion are the younger people. And they're young adults, and that's who we serve, 18 to 26. And when I interact with that community, I ask them, so, you know, your community doesn't use alcohol anymore? Oh, no, we don't drink. We just do pills. And that's an alarming statistic because, unfortunately, either those young folks are going to get sober or they'll be dead by the time they're 30. Whole generation being lost. Like I said, you know, leading cause of death for Americans under 50. It's really scary. And here's, you know, the hope is treatment can be effective. People do recover. And that's one of the things that we're not hearing a lot about. And part of it is because the recovering community has this whole tradition of anonymity. And really what we're trying to teach them is, how do you talk about your recovery without mentioning anything about your 12-step fellowship? Because I said to you this morning, you know, I'm a person in long-term recovery. This is what that means. I didn't do any drug talk. I didn't do any war stories. I didn't do any of that because you wouldn't get that, right, unless you're in recovery. Now, if I'm in an AA meeting, I can talk about that because people in an AA meeting get it, right? But someone who's not in that community doesn't understand that language. So there's a whole advocacy movement, you know, for people in recovery to come out of the shadows and say, I'm in long-term recovery, and this is what that means. You know, physicians, clergy, you know, everybody down the line, so that people know, oh, people do recover. There is hope. There is help. Right? This is a chronic illness that can be managed, and that's good news. Right? And that's really good news. So we live in hope. So I told Art I would stop at about 10 of. I just went 9 minutes past. So we have a couple minutes for any questions, thoughts, comments, anything that I might be able to speak to.
How do you draw the line between love and support versus the feeling of enabling and the thought of contributing to their further?
Yeah. When I'm talking to families, one of the things that I will suggest to them, do everything you can in your power to support their efforts at recovery. Right? Say no to anything that looks like active addiction. So, and so what that really requires then is the support and help of others. So a family that is, you know, seeking family counseling, mom and dad may be, getting some individual counseling. They might be part of Al-Anon, Nar-Anon, Families Anonymous, so that they're getting support for themselves, so they don't have to realize, oh my God, I don't know what to do here. Well, guess what? We're no longer alone. And we have other people that are navigating this issue successfully. How do we learn from them? Yeah. So, and that's kind of like setting that boundary, saying no sometimes is really hard when you love somebody, which is why having the perspective of others that are on that same journey who can share and say, this is what we did when we were in this situation, and here's how it worked for us. That support can be life-giving. Yeah.
I stepped out, if you said this already, I apologize, but as Michael said, Catholic Charities, we don't have any inpatient units and things like that. You're working for Ashley. Can you talk a little bit about the interface between seeing somebody has a severe problem and how to get them to a place like yours?
So some folks are ready to come, and so when a family member says, you need help, they're like, okay, I'll do it. Other folks need sometimes professional interventions, and interventions need to be done by somebody that's trained in it, not, a family member or a friend in recovery, because it could go sideways. And so someone that's trained in it can really help. Oftentimes it's, going through a mental health professional who might be able to make a referral because they know who we are, or they know some other, facility, or they know, sometimes through physicians who might be able to make a referral. That can be really helpful, And then always just sometimes picking up the phone and calling admissions and saying, this is what we have going on. What do we do? And then admissions staff or intake staff can kind of help explain what the process is. Yeah.
Thank you, Father Mark, for a lot of very good suggestions of what we can do in the church. My son is in long-term recovery, 5 years. He made it to Ashley 1.5 times. Thank you for the wonderful program, and it certainly was a long road for him to find recovery. One of the programs that he went to afterwards was an explicitly Christian program. You're probably familiar with Celebrate Recovery.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about that within the Catholic Church in terms of our outreach of doing a program like that goes back to the early days of the recovery and to take the actual message of the gospel, the Sermon on the Mount and the letters of James?
Yeah, I think, programs like Celebrate Recovery, which are kind of a Christian adaptation of the 12-step program, can be a great part of support for someone. There is something called Smart Recovery, which is more of a cognitive, behavioral, rational approach. And that works for some folks, because some folks really struggle with the whole God piece and the spirit piece. And, so they might, describe themselves as agnostic or atheist. And so how do we welcome and work with them? So Smart Recovery can become part of that. But and that's the beauty of 12-step fellowship, is welcoming everybody. Doesn't matter what you believe, what you don't believe, what you're coming to believe, what you're seeking to believe, everyone's welcome. And then along the way, how do we support one another, and how do we give God the opportunity to show up in our actions, so that in our actions, other people come to know the love of God? Because most of us experience God in community, and through the interactions with others, And I don't know if anyone's ever thought of it, or anyone has ever attended a 12-step meeting, but people come together and they gather, and then someone usually leads the meeting, and they break open some tradition or some reading or some topic, and then there's a lot of sharing, and people are nourished, and they leave to go back into their lives. What does that sound like? Coming together and gathering, right? Breaking open the Word of God, sharing and learning and praying, being nourished, and going out into the world. Exactly, right? We do it all the time. And so that experience of community becomes a place where people can oftentimes discover the love of God. A great friend of mine died with well over 45 years of sobriety, died a sober man, and described himself as an atheist. and asked me if I would preside at his funeral ceremony. And I said, Charlie, I'd be happy to. And we did. And the great love and joy that was in that room, right, was God present with his people. And if you can't experience God present with the people in ways like that, I don't know how you ever do. And sometimes, which is unfortunate, but sometimes the clergy conferences that I do, sometimes they'll say to me at the end, we wish we open our facilities to your fellowship meetings. I wish we could find a way to get what you have downstairs, upstairs. Yeah, so, and that's, I just think of a way of them acknowledging and complimenting that God is present with his people. There's a rabbi in Pittsburgh who did a lot of work. He's a psychiatrist, did a lot of work in recovery and working with people, and he decided, I need to attend 12-step fellowship meetings because I need to understand what's happening here so that when my people come to me, I'll be better equipped. Here's what he said: I've never been to a 12-step meeting where God hasn't shown up. A rabbi, physician, not in recovery, making a statement like that. Pretty neat. Yes?
Assume you have a set of parents who want to seek help for a child. They're ready to take a second out on their house to pay for inpatient rehab. They've Googled it. They've looked up different facilities. What advice would you give them about finding the right kind of facility? What elements would you like to see in a rehab that you think people ought to have in order to evaluate it, rather than just picking a place at random because they're expensive or because other celebrities go there?
Yeah, and unfortunately, in the treatment industry these days, there's a lot of bad players. And right now, the whole industry is getting in front of Congress and forcing the whole ethics issue, because there have been, with the parity legislation and with the change in healthcare laws, treatment became more and more accessible, so people began to decide, you know what, we can make some money here. And we can do it in a way that people are going to get hurt, unfortunately. So the industry is trying to combat that. But I would say certainly to look for some particular elements. So a program that has a comprehensive approach. So do they have really good medical care so that they can take care of any medical needs that the person has? Do they have a full complement of trained, licensed professional counselors and psychologists who can deliver really good clinical care? Is there a whole kind of wellness and spiritual care component to the treatment? And then what do they do in terms of follow-up and providing continuing levels of care and support for families and for the patient that's served? To me, like that whole comprehensive approach and understanding, are they using evidence-based practices? So at Ashley, we use medication-assisted treatment. We support medication-assisted recovery, whether it's Suboxone or the anti-craving medications. We have a whole host of folks that are trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, 12-step facilitation. We do the whole holistic approach with having acupuncture, massage, yoga, things for body, mind, spirit. We have the spiritual care folks, so we pray together for those who want to do it. We teach folks mindfulness meditation, making sure that all the pieces are there. Yeah.
How's the legalized marijuana issue affecting or exacerbating the...
Well, I think we're just really beginning to kind of wait and see how that's going to happen. We have a significant number of folks who, get addicted to marijuana. Sometimes the myth is, oh, this is a non-addictive substance. Well, science has proven that's not true. Unfortunately, with advances in agricultural science, what's being smoked today is significantly more potent than what it was in, say, like the 1970s. I mean, the level of THC is much higher. And so, the effects that it has on the developing brain of adolescents, huge issue. Driving under the influence, huge issue. And, so I think the whole thing of, medical marijuana, that's a farce, right? And what I believe is, if we want to have medical marijuana, let's do the research, let's extract the compounds from the plant, let's dose them and use them appropriate like we would any other medicine. Because I know physicians that say to me, there's no way you're going to convince me that smoking and ingesting a hot toxic substance into your lungs is any way good for you. So I think there's a place for using marijuana in medicine, but let's not kid ourselves that smoking it's the way to do it. Because to me that's, it's a lot of people going to make a lot of money on legalized marijuana, and the states being one of them. So I think we're at our end.
We're at our end. How about a round of applause?